Now, in the case of ancient church fathers like Jerome, Athanasius, and others, the church could overrule them. For example, Pope Damasus and Pope Innocent I both released decrees on the canon of the Bible, and various church councils did so as well. All of them rejected the notion that the Old Testament had to be limited to the Jewish canon. That should have been the end of the subject, but 1,000 years after the time of Jerome, in medieval Europe, Jerome began to gain a large amount of popularity among scholars. For example, in 1385, the preface to John Purvey's revision of Wycliffe's translation of the Bible specifically cited Jerome as an authority in questioning the canonicity of books like Tobit, Judith, and others, and he used the slur Apocrypha. However, the translation kept the disputed text in the Old Testament. Now, a century later, one of the greatest Catholic scholars was Tommaso de Vio, who was in Spain and was, because he was from a place in Italy called Gaeta, he was known as Gaetano and then later Cajetano, and in English somehow Cajetano became Cajetan, or whatever. Anyway, even this great scholar was infected with this tendency to appeal to the period when Jerome rejected the canonicity of the books found in the so-called Apocrypha. For example, in Cajetano's commentary on the book of Esther, Tommaso de Vio, Cajetano, he appealed to Jerome's aforementioned Prologos Geleatos, which is the famous text where Jerome specifically rejects the so-called Apocrypha, and Cajetano appeals to this text and used the slur Apocrypha specifically for Judith, Tobit, Maccabees, etc. Cajetano flatly said that they're not part of the canon, and then they can't be used to confirm positions of faith. And he conceded that certain church councils, Cajetano that is, conceded that certain church councils had recognized those texts as being part of the Bible, but perhaps misguided by the belief that the Old Testament, has to reflect the Jewish canon. He made the shocking claim that, quote, the words of the councils as well as the doctors are to be submitted to the correction of Jerome, end quote. Now, this was the state of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, where several men were intoxicated by the ideas of Jerome. The problem got worse with the Protestant Reformation, where many Christians broke away from the Church en masse. In 1435, Martin Luther produced his German translation of the Bible and became the first to rip the disputed texts out of the Old Testament and put them in their own quote-unquote Apocrypha section. Now, not even Jerome did this, as unlike Martin Luther, he was still under the control and guidance of the Church, and thus had to keep those texts in the Old Testament of his translation, regardless of whether he himself considered them canonical or not. Luther also clearly defined the word Apocrypha as a slur. He said, quote, Apocrypha, that is, books which are not held equal to the sacred scriptures, and nevertheless are useful and good to read, end quote. Now, all the early Protestants were themselves former Catholics, thus some were infected by Jerome's ideas, while others still considered the disputed text to be scripture. Having an Apocrypha section was a sort of a middle ground. It showed tremendous disrespect for the text by taking them out of the Old Testament, and it showed tremendous disrespect to the book of Esther and Daniel by ripping them apart, but it did not remove them entirely from the Bible. All English translations performed by the Protestants included the Apocrypha section. In 1535, the Miles Coverdale Bible had a preface which appealed to Jerome, just like Purvey and so on, and Cajetano. The Coverdale Bible's preface appealed to Jerome and flatly read as follows, quote, Apocrypha, the books and treatises which among the fathers of old are not reckoned to be of like authority with the other books of the Bible, neither are they found in the canon of the Hebrew, end quote. This is the same Jerome which the preface of the original King James Version in 1611 called, quote, a most learned father, end quote. Now, King James himself wrote a book titled Basilikon Doron, which gave his own position on the so-called Apocrypha. He wrote, quote, as to the Apocrypha books, I omit them because I am no papist, end quote. In other words, while UPKers make the ridiculous claim that the Catholics removed the so-called Apocrypha from the Bible, their own beloved King James took the common Protestant position that only a Roman Catholic would consider those books to be divine scripture. Now, some UPKers have asked the question, if King James did not believe in the Apocrypha, why did it appear in the King James Version? The answer is that this was a common practice of all Protestant translations up to that point. The King James Version is a Protestant translation, and a Protestant translation would use the Apocrypha as a slur. Putting those texts in their own Apocrypha section was meant to establish them as being of an inferior quality. That's something that's very important to keep in mind. Bibles produced by believers in those texts kept them in the Old Testament. And if you don't believe me, you can see any Roman Catholic or Orthodox Bible, that those who believe in those texts and consider them scripture keep them in the Old Testament. Putting them in an Apocrypha section was already a form of disrespect. I can't stress that enough. Finally, there's the question of why the Apocrypha was removed from Protestant Bibles like the King James Bible. The answer is that Protestants, like certain ancient Christians, believed that the biblical canon should just be the Jewish Tanakh and the New Testament. What was once considered the Puritan view became the dominant and nearly unanimous view amongst all Protestants. While Jerome was corrected by the Church, Protestants are independent and authorities unto themselves, and thus there was no one to overrule them when they decided the disputed text should be removed from the Bible. Gary Michuta's wonderful book titled Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger goes into the full details, and I highly recommend that book. Again, it's Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger by Gary Michuta. The short answer is that the British and foreign Bible societies were the producers of Protestant translations in the English language, and by the early 19th century, the anti-Apocrypha position had become dominant among Protestants. As a result, Protestant Bible publishers began producing translations which lacked the Apocrypha altogether. This has nothing to do with secret societies and, like the alleged biblical destruction group. And more importantly, Catholic and Orthodox Bibles continued to have those books in their Old Testament, and they continue to do so to this very day. A misguided notion about the canon became dominant among Protestants, and thus Protestant Bibles reflect that philosophical position. Now, finally, in closing, I wanted to note something humorous I noticed in one of Great Millstone's videos about the Apocrypha. Here, listen to Ariam Lab.
This right here is of the Spanish Bible, right? Right here you see Sagrada Escritura, which is sacred scriptures. Then it says Biblia, right? Now, you notice in the índice, Antiguo Testamento, or the Old Testament, you have what? You got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And as you scroll around, you start seeing books like Primer Maccabeos, which is First Maccabees, Judith, Tobias, or Tobias, Second Maccabeos, Second Maccabees, Baruch, and other books that belong to the Apocrypha, because this is the original one, and they took it out. See?
What Ariam Lab didn't seem to realize in that clip is that he was on the website of the Vicaría Episcopal de Pastoral Arquidiócesis de México, which is the Episcopal Vicariate of the Archdiocese of Mexico. Their website is vicariadepastoral.org.mx. This is a Roman Catholic site. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Mexico is the one who put up that site. And that was a modern Spanish translation. It was the Biblia de Jerusalén. It might have been the Nueva Biblia de Jerusalén, but the point is it's a modern Spanish translation, the Spanish equivalent of the famous Jerusalem Bible. It was a modern Roman Catholic translation that he was reading from, and he was calling it the original. Just wanted to make this small point, because the reason those books are in the Old Testament is because that's a Catholic Bible. I found that humorous. On that note, I think this two-part series has been a good starting point for this conversation, and I look forward to the comments of others.